This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Mono died as a consumer format back in 1968. But why are we not only still talking about it, but queuing up to buy it nearly 60 years later? I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video, I'll find out why this obsolete format continues to fascinate Beatles fans, and why it should never be forgotten. Explaining the Beatles in mono to a casual mainstream music fan today isn't easy. Perhaps the easiest way is to just say, "Alexa, play the Beatles." And for most people, that's all they need to know. Explaining how and why it can sound better than the same thing in stereo is more of a challenge.
This is a journey into sound, a journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience. Stereophonic sound.
For almost a decade between 1958 and 1968, the stereo mix of a song or album was little more than an afterthought. The version that was played on the radio or on the jukebox and became the hit was the mono mix. Mono mixes were carried out with skill and care, while stereo mixes were done quickly, usually by someone who'd never heard the mono mix and who wasn't sure the stereo mix would ever see the light of day. The Beatles cared about mono and would often be present for mono mixing of their records. The stereo mix was, up until Sgt. Pepper, little more than an afterthought and was done by a staff engineer, long after everyone else had retired to the nearest pub. Creating a quality mono mix has become a lost art and is more difficult than you think. But a well-produced mono mix can sound almost three-dimensional, especially when played on good quality equipment. However, for Beatles fans back in 1963, and to a certain extent the Beatles themselves, sound quality was the last thing on their minds. John, Paul, George and Ringo had grown up listening to music on a player like this, and knew what made an exciting sounding record. They were interested in sound and not sound quality. With its cardboard case and plywood motorboard, this valve-powered reproducer with its loud ceramic cartridge is what the vast majority of Beatles records were played on in the 1960s. You could put the most beat-up copy of any record on this turntable and it will sound good. And yes, the sound quality is a long way from perfect, but it has an authenticity which I love. Although EMI had been producing stereo records since 1958, it was, even up until the 1960s, quite a niche format. For hi-fi purists back then, it was reel-to-reel, not vinyl, that was the format of choice. And in the late 1950s, both Capitol and EMI began releasing stereo tape albums. These played at 7.5 inches per second, and in the case of the EMI tape albums, were duplicated 1-to-1 from the master and delivered incredible sound. However, these were strictly classical-only programs. Pop tape albums had to wait until 1962 in the UK, by which time EMI had downgraded their reel-to-reel albums to 3.75 inches per second, and in mono only. Capitol, on the other hand, produced reel-to-reel tape pop albums in both mono and stereo, on both 3.75 and 7.5 inches per second speeds. Curiously, EMI continued to produce commercial mono reel-to-reel tapes until September 1970, meaning that Abbey Road, Let It Be, and even McCartney's first solo album were all officially released in mono in the UK. Of course, they were only fold-downs of the stereo mixes, but like the fold-down of Yellow Submarine, they do, despite a significant high-end roll-off, have a unique sound to them. For the majority of their recording career, mono was the most important format for the Beatles. It was the way their music was heard by their fans, either on one of these or, just as importantly, on the radio. Back then, most music was listened to out of just one speaker. Although Please Please Me and With the Beatles were recorded using a twin-track system, this was not done with a view to producing a stereo mix, but rather to facilitate the creation of a strong mono one. The idea of putting all the instruments in one channel and all the vocals in the other was purely one of convenience. According to George Martin, This method allowed him to combine the two together to get a punchier sound than if he'd just recorded direct to mono in the first place. Although much of Parlophone's early album catalogue was released in stereo, George Martin paid little attention to it when it came to pop albums. In fact, at one point he even denied he'd ever done a stereo mix of Please Please Me. For most people, the Beatles' first two albums are best heard in mono, and certainly that was the official view when it came to releasing the CDs in 1987. However, the recent remixes on the new 62 to 66 album shows that they can sound good in stereo, so the sooner we get those albums out in remix stereo, the better. The Beatles' first 4-track stereo recording was I Want to Hold Your Hand in October 1963. This track has been mixed and remixed in stereo numerous times over the years, but for me, nothing can match the energy and sparkle of the original 45 mix, and the same applies to She Loves You. With mono mixes as perfect as these, I don't really get why anyone would want to try and make stereo mixes out of either of them. A Hard Day's Night was the first album to be recorded in 4-track stereo, and while it's more enjoyable in that format than the first two, it's the mono which has the magic. The only album, in my opinion, from that early period worth hearing in stereo is Beatles for Sale. Its stereo mix is as good as the mono is bad, and has that breath of life missing from any of their earlier and some of their later stereo mixes. Although the use of new arrangements and more complex recording techniques benefited the songs on Help and Rubber Soul, it could be said that that was to the detriment of the sound quality on those albums. Help in mono shares the same flat and dull sound as its predecessor, and early mono pressings of Rubber Soul were cut too loud. Curiously, in an effort to create a compatible mix, Rubber Soul's stereo mix reverted to the hard left-right separation of the first two albums. Even in 1966, when stereo was becoming more popular, more time and effort was still being spent on mono mixes than on stereo. And for me, Revolver is still best experienced in mono. As I said earlier, the Beatles were more interested in sound than sound quality, and getting the right feel was crucial for their next album.
I can't watch.
Me neither.
When I get my hands on those guys...
Uh-oh, now what? Cool, it's dark in here.
They must have forgot to pay their light bill.
Good old daylight.
We'll be safe now. Grizzly?
Any other words of wisdom?
No, but here's a few from our sponsor.
Running a business or creating content online to make money isn't easy, but creating a website with Squarespace is. Whether you're selling online courses, blogs, or videos, Squarespace makes it easy to monetize your content. With the help of their state-of-the-art Blueprint AI design system and templates, you can create a fully customizable website fast that will help you earn money and connect with your customers. A Squarespace website gives you everything you need to run your online business successfully, all in one place. From sending invoices, accepting payments, managing appointments, and more. Also, every Squarespace site comes with powerful SEO tools built in, so you show up more often in search and get discovered fast. To find out how Squarespace can take your business to another level, head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Having spent so much time recording Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles were anxious to be involved in the mixing process, which took a total of 3 weeks to complete in mono. The stereo mix, on the other hand, was completed in little more than 3 days. For the Beatles, the mono mix was the one, and all the 4-track overdubbing and other technical wizardry was nothing more than a means to an end in achieving a good mono mix. For the White Album, the final album to be released in the UK in both formats, each track was carefully mixed in mono after each session. The stereo mixes, on the other hand, were put off until the last minute. So again, it could be argued that the mono version is the most authentic way to hear that album, and I personally prefer it to the stereo version. Now, Capitol had given up on mono after the Magical Mystery Tour album, but it remained a viable format in some other countries around the world. For example, Abbey Road was released in mono in Brazil in 1969 and in Czechoslovakia in 1972. Both, of course, were fold-downs of the stereo version. The Beatles in mono limped on vinyl until the end of 1969, and Please Please Me, Help and Sgt. Pepper's were the final albums to be pressed on that format. And as soon as those stocks were exhausted, that was that for mono. Or so we thought. As sales of Beatles records surged in 1981, EMI decided to repress all of their albums in mono. They reportedly pressed 10,000 copies of each title, which became available in June 1981. These contained a mix of original 60s cuttings and recuts by EMI's original cutting engineer, Harry Moss. They were then, in 1982, put together in a box set. First as BMC 10, which was housed in a red box. An additional 1,000 sets were then assembled in black boxes, bearing the catalogue number BM1. In contrast to the red boxes, these were individually numbered and certificated. These were then exported to the US, where they retailed for $79 per set. Although the sound was excellent, the quality of the vinyl was not the best, and the covers were the standard non-flipback editions from the late 1970s. The first 4 Beatles albums released on CD were in mono. EMI opted to transfer the tapes with a stereo head, which now seems unforgivable, but at the time they believed it was the best approach. Those 4 albums also came out on vinyl in mono, and even though they were digital and in many cases DMM pressings, I thought they sounded better than their CD equivalents. Since then, 2 of the best-sounding Beatles box sets have been in mono. Firstly, the CD EP box set from 1992, which contains some of the best digital sources for the Beatles singles. And then there was the exquisite Singles collection from 2009. So all we need now is an analog cut EP vinyl box set. Now this, in my view, is one of the best box sets the Beatles have ever released. Not only did you get all of the albums newly transferred from the original mono tapes, but you got flipback covers and even reproduction inner sleeves. And it was no surprise that these were all printed in Japan. You even got original 1965 stereo mixes of Help and Rubber Soul thrown in for good measure. Unfortunately, it's been out of print for some years, and the market is currently awash with Chinese counterfeit sets. Sadder still is that just 2 of these mono albums are available on streaming. Now, for those like me who missed out on the mono box set back in 1982, this 2014 mono box set was a dream come true. However, for many Beatles fans who weren't vinyl collectors, and for those who had already purchased the stereo box set 2 years earlier, it was money they didn't need to spend. As a result, it sat on the shelves of many retailers for a considerable period of time. But in 2016, interest in vinyl began to surge and reignited the demand for this set, causing prices for used copies on the secondary market to reach up to $1,500. This, of course, brings us round to May the 29th, 2025, when Apple announced that the 2014 set would be available once more and would ship on July the 18th. Now, I understand that for some Beatles fans who already own this set, or perhaps don't collect vinyl, this was an underwhelming announcement. However, for fans who valued sound quality and could afford it, this was incredible news, albeit long overdue. But at the end of the day, it's not as clear-cut as saying which is the best format, but more of a question of saying which is the best mix. The Beatles' music perfectly illustrates the difference between the 2 formats. Take, for example, this
Say you want a revolution.
And this.
Say you want a revolution.
On the other hand, there's this
I nearly died.
and this.
I nearly died.
If you want to know what I think about the rollout of this set, and if I've ordered it, head on over to Steve Westman's channel after this video has ended, where I'll be chatting live with Steve at the top of the hour about this set and who knows what else. Just click here to go to that or on the link in the description. But that's all from me here, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.